Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Khan Grays Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're going to be talking about history and why it's important. Now, I personally think from my time in school that history was the worst subject being taught. But it was my favourite. Now, what I mean by that is this. It's a really fascinating subject, and without an understanding of it, it's very difficult to understand very much of what's going on in the world. Like, so whether you're a mathematician or you study English or you study this or that, whatever it is, yeah, right? If you don't understand the history of something, it's very difficult for you to actually fully grasp what it is that you're studying. And so history is vitally important, but in schools it ends up being this date and that king and that queen and And the reason I say it's the worst taught subject is because you're never taught why. You're never taught why you're learning about Henry VIII. You're never taught why you're learning about the American Revolution. You're never taught about why you're learning about suffrage movement or any of these kind of things, right? The why is the most important thing with history. This is what we're going to get into in this video. And before we do, just want to say, you know what the deal is. You're watching this now. If you haven't set up a YouTube account, set up a YouTube account. It takes 2 minutes. Go, like on the thing, and subscribe. So subscribe, yeah. If you do that, that helps out the channel a lot, because then that means that it shows YouTube that people are valuing my work, and you know, you'll be posted up with new content whenever I post up. I post twice a week. I try as much as possible to do it on Thursday and on a Sunday. So definitely stay tuned for stuff. But if you're subscribed, then you don't have to, run the risk of missing any videos, yeah, and it will help the channel out a lot. So with that said, let's get on to the rest of the video. The German philosopher Hegel said that what we can really learn from history are some of the lessons from it, right? So if we look at today, if we look at what's going on in the world today, or if we think about what may happen in the future, we have to look at the past and see where there are commonalities, because, as it's often said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, all right? So there's patterns that we can take from previous civilizations, from previous places' history, and we can see the parallels between the present society and and the future, right? So, and this can shape everything that we're doing, whether it's economics, whether it's in war, whether it's in politics, like kind of anything, right? It's really important to look into history and think, right, when has this moment happened before, and what were the consequences, right? Because Einstein famously said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and expecting a different result. Now, if we repeat the same mistakes from history, well, that's essentially madness, because we have all of the information there, we have all the stories, we know what end up happening, and oftentimes you see in history the same mistakes being done again and again and again, and no one is really taking the time to learn from those. And it's an incredible, it's either ignorance and not knowing history, or it's arrogance in terms of thinking that could never happen to us because X, Y, Z, yeah? So thinking about, for instance, the fall of Rome, you think, oh, well, our civilization is far too advanced and far too interconnected. Yeah, there's no way our civilization could collapse like Rome. Don't be too sure, because the people at the high point of the Roman Empire probably thought that their empire would last forever. So these are the lessons we have to learn, unfortunately. Now, to start off with this, yeah, we have to really think about, when does history begin, right? And that might seem obvious, but it's actually quite a complex question. Does it, is it at the beginning of the universe, right, with the Big Bang? Is it, is it Is it at the evolution of life, like kind of like the genesis of life? Is it when humans first evolved out of, out of like kind of apes? Like, when, is it when we had the first civilization? When does history actually start? Is it the first time that someone wrote down an event and said this happened before? Or is it the first time someone told a story about something that happened, right? Because history, there is no, it's quite difficult to say when there's a starting point, when there's an end point, right? But for the sake of this video, we'll just talk briefly about the history of human beings, right? So, human beings arose out of Africa, we believe, around 200,000 years ago, and so our ancestors, the evolution of grass is actually quite well correlated with the development of like early humanoids, right? So you had, before, about like 7 million years ago or thereabouts, right? In Africa, where our species originated from, you had huge forest lands, right? That covered most of the continent, right? And then around that time, you started to have a drier, you started to have like a drier climate, right? And what ended up happening is that the forest ended up shrinking, and a new, relatively new plant type called grass started to arise, right? So the grasslands end up pushing the forest back further and further. And so our ancestors were up in the trees, yeah, and when they were looking about for food, bit by bit they have to, forage around in the grasslands, right? Or if they had to go from one bit of forest to the next, they had to cross that. And you can see this with chimps today, right? Having to cross the grasslands of the savannah. Obviously, doing this poses a great lot of risk, right? If you're going about on your hands and feet, it's, you are not able to see as many things. You're not able to see that lion that's like kind of hiding in the grass, like kind of, you know what I mean? Like, you're not able to see the elephant that's over there. So standing on our hind legs, being bipedal, as they say, that was a massive like help to us, right? And so the early humanoids basically started to develop and become more and more upright and more, using tools and using different things to kind of like, to get food, and yeah, so over time ended up evolving into many different species, like Homo erectus, like kind of, and all these other like kind of species and stuff, right? And eventually we get to a point around 200,000 years ago where human beings, Homo sapiens sapien, like as they're referred to, started to develop around East Africa. Probably we expect somewhere around Lake Victoria, so kind of like Uganda, Kenya, like those kind of places, right? So with those early humans, they then bit by bit started spreading out, and this was, looking for food, like kind of fleeing from warring tribes, this sort of thing, right? And bit by bit, over hundreds of thousands of years, humans spread out. We believe from Africa, well, they spread around to the rest of Africa. Then we believe that they crossed over into the Arabian Peninsula, came up through that way, and went into Europe, went into Asia, crossed the Bering Strait. So the little gap between Siberia and Alaska, and that's how they believe people got to the Americas. And then going all the way around India and to Southeast Asia and all those places, and like all the way to Australia, and then people setting out little like rafts and stuff and exploring the Pacific, right? So that's basically how human beings spread across the world, right? But for the vast majority of our existence, right? So you think about 200,000 years, right? Civilization, as we can think about it, only began about 9,000 years ago, right? So you're talking about the vast majority of human existence, yeah, was just hunter-gatherer. You're looking for berries, you're finding something, like you're finding an animal, killing it, etc., right? So this is how we lived for the vast majority of our time, right? And then around 9,000 years ago, people started to do agriculture, right? And that was that's we look at agriculture now and think that that makes sense, right? But the amount of foresight and the amount of risk taking it takes to be like, right, I'm going to plant these seeds, and in a few months' time, they will develop food and stuff, right? This is something which, a lot of animals don't think this far ahead, right? So a wolf, for instance, when it has food, it will just gorge an entire, like kilos and kilos of meat and stuff because it doesn't know the next time it's going to have food. So it doesn't think, oh, let me eat a bit now and save some for later, right? But human beings have that kind of innate ability to do long-term planning, and that's really essential. Like being like, I could eat these seeds now, or I could plant them and grow them for later, right? That is really innovative, and this basically was the development of agriculture. Now, with the development of agriculture, you started to see, more settled places, right? You started to get early sort of things of like, right, this is, rather than us just being nomads and going from one place to the next and just looking for food, it started to be a bit more like territorial and a bit more like, well, this is our land, this is where we grow our plants and stuff, right? And we need to defend things from being robbed, so especially because not everyone all of a sudden just decided let's start farming and stuff, right? So you still had people who are going from one place to another and stuff, like kind of those kind of people needed to be defended against, right? So you needed to start, and this is where people started to build little villages, little towns, and as a kind of defensive mechanism to be like, right, this is our little community, and we're defending against like people who are just wandering about, like kind of like trying to take things from us, right? And it's how we start seeing the development of early civilization and stuff, and you see it in particular in the Middle East, in what's known as Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia means the place between two rivers, so the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is modern day Iraq. This is the cradle of civilization as such, right? So and you start to, completely independently of each other, right? You start to see places in China develop. You start to see places in Egypt, all the kind of places that have like regular rivers that are navigable, which means that boats can go along it. So if there's like huge like water rapids and etc., then it's not helpful. If you've got like calm water that floods regularly and you can kind of predict it and stuff, that makes a very easy way of developing crops and stuff, right? So you see this in the Indus Valley in Pakistan, in modern day Pakistan. You see it in many different places like around the world, right? And this is essentially how people started building up until eventually you get to the state where you have empires and war, and the war, the technology that comes from war, the competition that comes from war has been a huge part of the development of people. Obviously, a lot of people have died from it, needless to say, but the struggle to outdo the next group of people and to outdo that has had huge impact on the development of human beings, right? And so that's kind of, and then skip forward hundreds and hundreds of thousands, skip forward thousands of years rather from that point. We then end up with, so we've had agriculture, you've had the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, you start getting the Iron Age, and again, the empires build bigger. You start having like ancient Greece, Persia, Rome, ancient China, all these kind of places, right? And then the next kind of thing we can really think of, and again, this skips over hundreds of years, right? Like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? We get to a point where human society had pretty much kind of existed similarly in a fundamental sense. It kind of existed for the same. It obviously had changed over time, but there wasn't much of a difference in terms of. So someone living in 1700, like an ordinary person, and someone living in perhaps Roman times, obviously things would have been very different in some ways, but the general way of their life, like being small farmers, maybe being small like traders or whatever, is like very small and very very primitive essentially, right? And all of a sudden you start to have, the agricultural revolution, right? And with that agricultural revolution, you have the industrial revolution, and now all of a sudden people are flocking to the cities, yeah, and the population becomes a lot more urbanized. They become a lot more literate, so they're able to read and write, and the level of education, the emergence of different ideas, the innovation, the industry that comes with that and stuff, right? The ends up creating a huge expanse of wealth, like the likes of which hadn't been, and the standards of ordinary people, although we all often think of like kind of Dickensian, like kind of misery, like kind of like people being poor, etc., etc. Actually, in terms of, in contrast to how people lived in the countryside, these like factory workers, whatever, were far better off, right? That's why they didn't all go back to the countryside, because comparatively things were much better off. And as we've approached more modern times, it's a thing where the standard of living people has really risen to the point where ordinary people, like some of the poorest people in developed nations, live better than medieval kings and queens did. And it's, so this is kind of the broad kind of expansive history, but there's so much more with it as well. It's not just about technological, like kind of innovation and stuff. It's also about how we've developed our ideas over time, how we've developed our societies over time, and how we've kind of, well, for lack of a better word, how we've evolved as human, as like modern day man. And on top of all this, it's a thing of our, our history is, everything about how we live is shaped by our history, right? So I'm speaking to you now in English, right? That language 1,000 years ago was very different, almost in this, like you almost couldn't like tell that they were the same languages, right? And how the English language has now developed is a thing where it's as a consequences of all the migrations and invasions and influences from different like other cultures and stuff over time. So the structure of our language is Germanic, right? So English is a Germanic language, but because of, for instance, the invasion of because of the invasion of the Romans and the Normans, we have a lot of influence from Latin and French, right? And like even the fact that our language is Germanic, that comes from the Anglo-Saxons, like kind of like invading after the fall of Rome and in between the invasion of the Normans, right? So even the very language that I'm speaking to you now is a product of all these different things, never mind all the different places that we've also explored, and like many different words have been borrowed from places that Britain conquered. So for instance, the word jungle derives from the Hindi word for jungly, which means wild. So so the word jungle essentially means like wild place kind of thing, right? You have pajamas, you have many different things, right? And this comes from the legacy of Britain being an imperial country and being in India, right? So many things that we kind of just take for granted and stuff, right? It's a thing of that, all of that is the product of history. Like you wouldn't be here sat watching this YouTube video if it wasn't for you being the product of history. And the fact is as well that you are, every single one of your ancestors successfully lived long enough to reproduce and to pass on their genes stuff. And this goes all the way back from you now all the way to the very first life form, maybe like 3.5 billion years ago, right? So you wouldn't be here today were it not the product of a very extensive history that we have. We're nowhere near fully getting to the bare bones of, right? And so that's essentially this. There's many other reasons why you should care about history, but the fact that you exist, it should be reason enough to care. But Kwame, I don't understand. I mean, like, history happened a long time ago and it's boring and I don't really care and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, anyway, Yeah, that annoying voice came back again. If you've seen them in a previous video, yeah, you'll know what I'm on about. About that. Yes, again, that doesn't make that doesn't make any sense at all. Because, okay, even even to the extent of us having like kind of like the world that we live in at the moment, right, is fraught with many different debates, many different topics, many different arguments people are having and stuff, right? And all of that is tied up with history and how we view it, right? So, as I have said in a previous video as well, like the little quote that comes from me, we are nothing more than the amalgamation of everything that we think has happened and everything that we think will happen. And all of that is rooted in history, right? So, debates at the moment about race, about this or that, all of that is tied up with how we view the past and competing visions of the past and different emphasis on different things within the past are what shapes nearly every political debate that we have. And even if you don't think that you're interested in politics, first of all, watch my video on why you should care about politics, right? And watch my other videos as well, obviously. But like, it's a thing of the influence that history has had on those events. That's what people are arguing about. People are arguing about the history of it, right? So as much as people might be caught up in the moment here, you can't take it out of the context of the history in which it's written, because if you talk about race relations, for instance, in the US, well, if you don't start with looking like hundreds of years ago to when the first slaves were brought over, as an example, if you're not looking further back than that at like everything to do with like human interactions over time, all these kinds of and like the very concept of slavery over the millennia, right? If you're not kind of looking at all these things in its entirety, you're just going to get a snapshot thing of this is what it is at the moment, right? And you're not going to have any idea or real valid point that you can really talk on if you're ignorant of the history, right? So, and oftentimes a big problem I have with the way history is taught is that it's very much taught from whatever country you're from, right? So if you're American, you learn American history. If you're British, you learn British history. If you're like, right? And the point is that while it's very important to help build a national sense of oneself, yeah, and to be like, right, we are the British, we are the Americans, stuff, that is very important to do. That's a very fundamental reason for the history, right? But there's no such thing as like British history or American history or white history or black history or like the history of human beings are all interconnected. You can't tell the history of one place without talking about other places in relation to it, right? You can't talk about the history of America without the history of Britain. You can't talk about the history of Vietnam without the history of America and without, you know what I mean? Like every single place, you can't talk about the history of India without the British and vice versa. Like all these different places, right? The whole world is interconnected. It's a globalized world, and every single part of it, even down to even the chips that you eat, yeah, right? So like if you're eating potato, that came from South America, right? And also, history really does make us have to think about the fact that human beings are incredibly resilient, right? And when we think about, there might be an impending climate crisis, right? And we're all struggling to think about how we'll survive that, how we'll cope, how we'll manage. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that human beings have experienced like near death extinction, like near extinction levels of like devastation in our history already, right? And time again, it upends a lot of things and it causes, a lot of turbulence and a lot of strife and a lot of chaos and a lot of death. But at the same time, human beings have shown themselves to be very innovative and very resilient, and a great deal of why we're here at the moment is because of that. So, a key example of this is around, I think, 74,000 years ago. You had the Mount Toba eruption out in Indonesia, right? This is a mega explosion. And, when you think about is a lot of people talk about Yellowstone, a lot of people talk about Krakatoa, all these kind of things, right? So this was like like devastating level of like, this is a huge eruption, right? Like this is the kind of eruption where it would be so loud that literally everywhere in the whole world would be able to hear it. That's not an exaggeration, right? So, and the ash cloud from that was so intense that it ended up, circling the world and lowered global temperatures significantly. And a lot of species died in that time. And obviously, this is during the time where we had ice ages as well. And it's believed that human beings got down to a position of somewhere in the region of about 1,000 people. We don't know for sure, obviously, but archaeologists seem to believe, and and geneticists have looked into it, and they believe that there's about 1,000 human beings who survived the consequences of that explosion, right? So we were almost wiped out, and yet today there's 7.5 billion of us, right, and growing. So whatever disaster we might come up against, there's a high probability that we will continue. Rome, we talk about the fall of Rome, but Rome is still here today. We talk about the fall of this place or that place, but even when empires fall, it's not as if there's a desert in its place, right? There's always something that continues. And even when we think about places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two cities that were bombed in World War II, like with nuclear explosions, there's still people living there. Well over 1 million people living in these cities. So in spite of all the destruction, in spite of all the difficulties, in spite of everything that we have to come against, it's a thing of human beings will find a way to survive and thrive. And even nations like Israel or Poland or many other places, right, which can be invaded, can be occupied, brutally destroyed, scattered amongst the nations, etc., etc. Even nations such as this, hundreds, if not thousands of years after it, they can still find a way of coming back together, right, and being stronger than ever. So while it's important to look out for potential disasters, it's also a thing of learning from history and recognizing that human beings will find a way to bounce back, can find a way to bounce back. And so, by looking at history, we can take a pessimistic view, but I think that it's probably better to take a more optimistic view of history because, there's we, as Isaac Newton says, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And realistically, we are here because of the great work which people have been doing since the dawn of time, really. And just want to finish by saying a quote from George Orwell, which really summarizes the importance of history. He who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. So if we do not take the time to learn history, if we don't take the time to educate ourselves into how we got to where we are, it's a thing of whoever's currently controlling things in the present can erase our history, and then through teaching us other things, it can shape our entire future, and we're lost to our past. It's the quickest way to destroy a civilization is to destroy its past. And that's why we have to look at history, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we have to learn from it together. And we need to keep having debates about the different interpretations of history, and that's the only way that we can build a brighter, better future. So, with that, have a great day. Like, subscribe, and see you soon. And also, don't forget to comment in the comment section as well. Hopefully you like this video and you want to express how much you did like it, or you might just be a hater. In which case, keep hating away.